Okay, I realize that people will trickle in, but it's 8 o'clock, so we're going to, in the interest of time, get started. So I'd just like to say good morning and thank you for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lenore Jarvis. I'm one of the pediatric emergency medicine attendings here, and I founded the Help for Victims of Violence Collaboration at Children's National. So today the topic is domestic violence. We realize that domestic violence affects people of all shapes, size, socioeconomic status, and level of education. In fact, according to the CDC, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have been victims of some form of violence with an intimate partner during their lifetime. At least 1/3 of women murdered in the U.S. are killed by an intimate partner, with 16 to 24-year-olds being most at risk. In fact, I think several of you maybe in this audience helped with a pretty horrific case over the weekend that really affected one of our families and several of our patients that involved domestic violence. Last year, we held a professorial rounds in honor and memory of the 3 Children's National staff members who were murdered through acts of intimate partner violence. This year, I would like to draw attention to the Children's National Improved Cerner Domestic Safety Screening that went live on October 27th. Although the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Women's Preventative Service Guidelines and the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force recommend that clinicians screen for intimate partner violence, domestic safety screening is not always done. The Cerner Domestic Safety Screening improvements that went live hospital-wide on 10/27 include updated screening questions based on evidence-based medicine, required fields, and an automated social work consult to address positive screens. As such, it is important for us to learn about our role that we can play in protecting our patients, families, and colleagues. At this time, I'd like to offer a special thanks to the Children's Health Board Grant and its president, Rosalia Miller, for providing funding for our guest speaker today, Jenny Brody. She is an expert on domestic violence. Jenny Brody is the co-founder of the DC Volunteer Lawyers Project, an organization providing legal services to domestic violence victims and at-risk children. Ms. Brody has practiced family law in Washington, D.C. for more than 10 years, including serving as a member of the D.C. Superior Court's Council for Child Abuse and Neglect attorney panel. She previously worked as an attorney in the United States Department of Justice, civil appellate staff, and in private practice. Ms. Brody earned her JD from Harvard Law, and she was also named the Washingtonian of the Year in 2015 for her work with victims of domestic violence. Please help me welcome Jenny Brody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jarvis, and to everyone here taking time out of their busy schedule to attend to these really important issues. And I really kudos to Children's Hospital for focusing on this and adding it to the screening, and I'll touch hopefully on some reasons why it's so important. As Dr. Jarvis mentioned, I work with the DC Volunteer Lawyers Project, and we see probably about 350 victims of domestic violence every year, both providing representation in court and also in our walk-in domestic violence clinic, which I'll talk about later. But I've counseled counseled and represented many hundreds of victims during the time I've been involved. So I think you all know the CME objectives. I'm not going to go over each one of them, but I do want to focus on just a few. One is the effects of domestic violence on children and families. I will talk about the cycle of abuse that tends to trap victims in these relationships and makes it so hard to leave. We'll talk quickly about a few factors which are red flags in domestic violence and predictive of actually lethal violence, and talk about your obligations as mandatory reporters. And most importantly, be aware of legal and social services that can make a huge difference and help victims to extricate themselves from these situations that they're in. So just a quick word about terminology. It's sort of always evolving. The term domestic violence has been somewhat replaced by the term intimate partner violence, or IPV, sometimes called relationship violence. So I tend to use these terms interchangeably. The legal term for what's going on is called an intra-family offense, which means a criminal act, which is assault, which is committed by someone who is in a relationship with the victim of the assault, typically blood, marriage, having children in common, or romantic. And I refer to the abuser throughout this presentation just for use of reference as he, and the victim or survivor as she, because that is usually the configuration we see, although of course it could be the other way around. And my organization does represent men who are victims of domestic violence. And also even the difference between victim and survivor is somewhat controversial in my field because people prefer the appellation survivor, but actually legally the person is considered the victim of a crime. That's what they are. So I tend to use that more often. So Dr. Jarvis did touch on some of the statistics regarding prevalence of domestic violence. And one thing, 3 women nationally are killed every day in this country by an intimate partner. It's pretty horrifying. And again, focusing on the highest risk group, 16 to 24, rates of domestic violence 3 times the national average. And what that means for you is that that's both the mothers of many of the children you see are in that age group, but it could also be your patients, maybe actually victims of domestic violence, not just exposed to violence against a parent. You might see either scenario, actually, and I think the screening tool takes that into account in the questions that are asked. And just on a local level, you know, domestic violence could be termed epidemic in DC in terms of one measure is the amount of calls into Metropolitan Police Department that involve a domestic violence incident, and also petitions filed in Superior Court for restraining orders, or what we call civil protection orders in this jurisdiction. And obviously that's a very small percentage of the overall domestic violence. Again, some points worth noting is that rates of domestic violence in same-sex relationships are the same as in heterosexual relationships. So because you're seeing parents perhaps who are same-sex couples or patients, it doesn't mean you can assume no DV. Certainly it cuts across age, economic status, economic background, and just personally, my organization has represented, and we do represent primarily women, but women who are lawyers at top law firms here in town, women who are police officers, nurses, teachers, and military personnel. So, and all of them were shocked to find themselves as domestic violence victims, and even had trouble recognizing that they were. So although you see this issue across all spectrums, it is also true that domestic violence is 10 times more prevalent among women living in poverty. So there's definitely a relationship between poverty and domestic violence. So another thing to understand about it is that the physical violence in a typical relationship is really the tip of the iceberg, because domestic violence is primarily one person trying to assert power and control over another. And so there's a lot of other things that are going on. The first is using threats to coerce and control the other person. The threats are usually physical harm or taking children away. Abusers usually control all of the finances in a family so that the victim has no independent access to family finances. Isolating the victim from family and friends is very typical, so she has no support, and inflicting psychological harm, blaming the victim in other forms. So in terms of threats, these are just some cell phone screens that we introduced at evidence in a case involving one of our clients. She was a young woman who was in this country illegally, or as we say, she was undocumented. And she was actually worked in the janitorial staff at the local hospital. The abusive party was a U.S. citizen and coerced her into a sexual relationship. They had a 3-year-old child. So I think these are fairly legible, but I'll just go ahead and read them out loud. This is when he had physically abused her very severely, and she left the relationship with her child. And these are the messages she found on her phone. I will not let you break up my love. That's an interesting expression. You can be mad and upset all you want. If you F someone else, I will kill you. I promise you, you are mine forever. You see a lot of control attempts there. And then it says, Child Protection Service will have a talk with you soon and begin to pack your bags. Immigration will be talking to you soon. Also, you are not supposed to be here. And again, that is, she's undocumented. So you can readily imagine the terror, how terrifying it would be for a young undocumented person to receive these kind of threats. And just as by way of background, this abuser did try to make good on all of them, as far as we know. He had tried to kill her previously in, very severe domestic violence. Once she became our client, we represented her in a whole range of cases to address these concerns. The first was we obtained a civil protection order on her behalf, which kept him from contacting her or her child, and we'll talk more about that later. The second thing is he did call Child Protective Services, alleging that she was abusing her child. That was not the case, and we defended her against those charges. The third thing was that he filed a case for custody against her, filed a complaint trying to get custody of their child. And we filed a counterclaim, and we're able to get an order awarding her sole custody of her child and assessing child support. And we don't know if he called immigration or not, but we filed for something called a U visa, which is, we'll talk more about at the end, but it's a special visa available to victims of domestic violence. It was successful, and she is actually now a legal permanent resident. She can work legally, and so, in sum, her life is significantly better, as a result of the legal remedies that were available to her to help her get out of this terrible situation. But these types of threats are very, very common, and the most common one we see is to take the children away. So just quickly, specific risk factors about domestic violence. This has been studied extensively. It was pioneering work done in 1985 by a nurse named Jacqueline Campbell at Johns Hopkins, and she studied cases of lethal domestic violence and identified some of the risk factors associated with those cases. And these risk factors have since been field tested by law enforcement and studied very extensively and found to be very accurate predictors of escalating and even potentially lethal domestic violence. So I've just indicated, each risk factor and the extent to which it increases the odds of a lethal domestic violence incident. And threats to kill are number one. And of course, we saw that on that cell phone screen. So when someone threatens to kill an intimate partner, the odds are they're going to try to do it. Attempted strangulation we see very, very often in our cases. And again, it's an indicator of lethal violence. One of the most obvious ones that's often overlooked is estrangement from the abuser. So research shows that at the point when a victim tries to leave an abusive relationship, the risks of all types of violence increase 75%. This is the time when the victim is most at risk, is when she tries to leave, which is, a really terrible trap to be facing if you're a victim. And if you see a woman who's being abused when she's pregnant, that's also a very serious red flag. And then looking at from the perspective of the perpetrators of violence and what kind of red flags you're likely to see on that end, access to firearms increases risk of lethal violence 20 times, unfortunately very common. Access to either legal or illegal firearms. Really want to focus on substance abuse, and the two that we see being most problematic are alcohol. It is involved in so many domestic violence incidents, both in D.C. and I think probably everywhere, far more harmful than a lot of illegal drugs. But the other thing that I do want to focus on in D.C. is PCP abuse. It has, for some time, PCP has been an epidemic here. It's a drug, I don't know how many people are familiar with it, but it can cause a violent psychotic reaction among users. It's very unpredictable. Sometimes it produces a feeling of euphoria, and then other times really induces a psychotic state, and people under the influence of PCP have perpetrated horribly violent acts, including against their own children in some situations because they're delusional. We see it a lot in children born in DC with a positive tox for this particular drug, and it is very common. So if you're talking to a mom who may be a victim of domestic violence, and the abuser is known to use PCP, that is a huge red flag. Other characteristics on the part of the perpetrator that increase risks of domestic violence are unemployment, prior criminal records, and threats to commit suicide if she leaves him, which is something very often, the text we saw, it was, if you try to leave me, I'll kill you, the victim. But another thing you see is, if you leave me, I'll kill myself, but that often ends up being a homicide situation where he kills both her and himself. So that one is a big red flag too. So then the next question people often ask is, this is awful to be in a relationship with, where you're being physically abused, so why doesn't she leave? This has just happened to be an incident that was in the news. This is a photo of the singer Rihanna. She was severely beaten by her boyfriend, Chris Rock, in 2012. And this was a photo, I guess, taken by the police and later released. And this is a picture of her with the same person, Chris Rock, a year later. And so, that sort of thing is publicized fairly often in the media, and to many people just seems completely inexplicable what could be going on there. So this is often understood partly as a cycle of violence. And, one thing we always say is none of our clients get involved with an abuser. They get involved with a man who's loving, romantic, showering them with attention, behaving in a very loving way toward them, and then they get involved and often have children with that person, and then subsequently the person either reveals himself to be an abuser or something changes in his life and he becomes an abuser. And one of the things most often, a story I've heard is, there's a military base here, and he was a great guy, and he came home from Afghanistan. He was a completely different person. Even his own family didn't recognize him. He started drinking heavily, and then the abuse started. I've heard that from the wives of law enforcement, too. So something happens in the person's life. They start drinking or abusing substances, and they become abusive. And now the victim is trapped in this cycle. And again, abuse is not going on 100% of the time in these relationships at all. There are long periods of time where the relationship is completely normal and seemingly normal and loving and supportive. So what happens in stage one is tension starts to build as the abuser becomes moody or irritable or agitated, and the victim feels she's walking on eggshells, is the way that's usually described. And then in stage two, there is an act, there's an explosion and an act of physical violence and often destruction of property. And that's the explosive stage. It's followed immediately by the honeymoon stage, in which the abuser is apologizing profusely. He is so sorry. This will never happen again. Often he even will promise to get treatment for his drug or alcohol problems or whatever else. And sometimes he also subtly blames the victim. If only you wouldn't do X, I wouldn't get so angry. If only you had dinner ready on time, this wouldn't have happened. And so she stays in the relationship because he's so sorry and he's promised it'll never happen again. And then the tension starts building again, and the whole thing keeps going. So research shows that it takes a victim 7 to 8 attempts on average to leave an abusive relationship. And again, we see this very often when someone comes in for a CPO. It's maybe that they've filed several times in the past and not followed through. And, some of the factors which might be keeping the person, again, the cycle of violence is just one factor. There's also shame and stigma, as you can imagine. In this city and among poor people, lack of resources, especially housing in D.C., is at crisis proportions. Where is she going to go? And then there's the fear, the text threats, the losing her children, possibly deportation. So this is a short video I'm going to present. This is one of our clients named Sakai Johnson, who graciously offered to present at a training program for lawyers and to have her remarks used in training programs. And the person with her is one of the attorney who represented her in her case. And she talked several times about how it was a long, involved process, which is actually atypical, as we'll talk about. Actually, legal relief is very fast for domestic violence in court on the civil side. The abuser in her case was also being prosecuted criminally because it was very severe violence, including strangulation. And that was why she had to keep coming back to court. But I think the thing that, so there's some discussion of the legal process and why it was important to her to have a lawyer. But there are other things in her remarks which I think are also significant for your practice, which is the fact that she has 3 young children in the home. So let's see how we're going to, whoops, I'm going to do this.
May of last year, me and my kid's father, we had gotten to a domestic violence altercation, which led to him being put out and me having to go through the whole process of getting a CPO and just a very long, drawn-out process. And it was it affected me a lot because I have 3 small children, so they were definitely affected by the situation more than anything. And my goal for it was for me just to, well, the situation where I had was basically I was very dependent on my child's father because he was the primary breadwinner in our household. So it had happened on other occasions prior to this, but I guess that was my last, my last straw, you know, basically where I just was fed up and tired. And it took a lot, but eventually, you know, I just had the strength, and then I also had Ms. Flanagan here to help me with the situation, and basically I was able to obtain the CPO, and it was a long, drawn-out process, but it was worth it at the end. And to me, I think that if I didn't have the process of me going through the Lawyers Project, then I probably wouldn't have went through the whole process on my own. I probably would have backed out and just, you know, because it's happened before where I have obtained the protection order and ended up just going back and, you know, it was basically the same cycle. But going through the process, I went on and was able to actually obtain it and continue to just, you know, make progress in my life without having to deal with the abuse. So.
Okay. Well, can you give us advice about, you know, helping someone go through the process?
My advice would be, I think some people, you know, including myself, will be kind of, in the beginning, it's kind of like a rush where you're like, okay, you know, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. And then kind of like as the process goes, because we had to keep going back and forth to court, and it was pretty much kind of time-consuming. Also, it was just like more so, you know, after a while, it's just like, you know, you just don't even feel like dealing with it. But if you do have a client, I think it's good to kind of more, you know, push them and just, you know, obtain for them to be self-sufficient and be able to do this, you know, with the help of somebody else, but to also be able to do it without, just with somebody, just helping them to be there as a guidance for them, because without the help of other people involved, it's kind of hard to be able to do it by yourself. So my advice would kind of be just to push them, I mean, not too far, but, you know, just to be able to just let them know that you're there and you're pretty much willing to help them if needed, you know. My whole initiative to keep doing it was because it wasn't just for myself, but it was also for my kids, but it was also for my kid's father as well, because it was something for him to, he never had any basically any actions, any consequences to his actions. So it was always like, okay, well, it happens, we'll get through it, we get over it, and then that's it. Everything's back to normal for the time being, like the little honeymoon stage. Everything's fine, and then all of a sudden, a couple months down the line, a year down the line, then it's the same. We're back to square one. So he pretty much never had any consequences to his actions, and for me, that was something that I wanted just for him so that he could be a better person in general, and also for my kids so he could be a better father for him, and just for him to be a better person so that when he's in the next relationship, that he still doesn't have those same issues, pretty much.
Okay. So a couple of things about that. First of all, I think Sakai Johnson, it might not fit your typical image of a domestic violence victim, or maybe she does, I don't know. I mean, she's wearing scrubs, she works in a medical setting, she's reasonably, calm and well-spoken person, and of course she's out of the abusive relationship now, but this was pretty much her affect, and she does not appear really distressed or depressed, at least to me. I'm not a clinician, but that is true of many of our domestic violence clients, in my experience, are never what you expect. They could be feisty, they could be withdrawn, they could be, there's just a whole range of aspects, and you really can't predict just by looking at the person or talking to them necessarily what's going on. But the thing I do want to focus on is there are other, she's, obviously was a victim of severe violence, but there were other victims in this situation. That was her 3 children that she alludes to, and the fact that she kept going back. So they were exposed to domestic violence against their primary caretaker many times over the course of their lives, and they're very young. So this was a constant for them, during a really formative period in their life. So that brings us to the question of the effect of domestic violence on children, which has been studied quite a lot. So probably many of you are familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or the ACEs study, and it's essentially 10 factors, 10 adverse childhood experiences, and one of them is exposure or witnessing violence against a mother. And they don't talk about witnessing violence against a father, they talk about a mother, but could be either parent. But the point is that is one of the 10 ACEs that and as we know, these ACEs are associated with a wide range of negative physical and mental problems for people throughout the lifespan. And of course, it's compounded depending on how many you have. So again, the prevalence, the estimates are 5 to 10 million children witness domestic violence every year in the United States. Children exposed to domestic violence have significant psychological problems, often meet criteria for diagnosis of PTSD as a child, and significantly have lower IQs and problems with learning and attention. And one study that struck me is that children exposed to domestic violence at age 5 have an IQ 8 points lower than their peers, which is pretty significant. Some of the other things in terms of outcomes in adult life, 6 times more likely. This is just focusing on children exposed to domestic violence, just the one factor on the ACEs. 6 times more likely to commit suicide, more likely to abuse substances, 74% more likely to commit a violent crime against others, which is a particularly chilling statistic, and much of that is domestic violence. And in fact, usually what studies show is that boys who witness domestic violence as children are twice as likely to become abusers as adults. So the point there is that by stopping this violence, again, children from witnessing violence, you can also help stop the spread of violence to another generation, which is really significant. I was also struck by this recent study. This was by an economist, and he showed that having at least one student in a classroom who's exposed to domestic violence at home resulted in lower test scores for all of the students in the classroom, which is fairly extraordinary. And in various ways, he corrected for the effects of poverty in these schools. So just that one child in the classroom, the disruption caused by the child acting out, other factors cause all of the children in the classroom to be affected on a pretty significant basis. So given these really adverse effects on children from witnessing domestic violence in the home, this brings us to the legal doctrine of failure to protect. So this is a recent case concerning that. It was here in D.C. The caption indicates that it went up on appeal to the Court of Appeals. So what happened in this case was that a mother she was in a domestic violence shelter here in D.C. because of an incident of violence, and she had 2 young daughters. She left the shelter to return to her abusive husband, and the older child told the shelter staff that she was afraid to go home because of the violence that she had witnessed against her mother at home. So the shelter staff notified Child Protective Services, CFSA, that's Child and Family Services Agency, investigated and removed the child from the home. And then CFSA would typically bring an action against both parents in this case, and the parents contested the child's removal. And just one interesting fact is in those circumstances, both parents are entitled to court-appointed counsel, as you would be in a criminal case, because removal of a child violates a constitutional right or involves the constitutional right of the parents to parent their child. So both parents in this case would have had court-appointed counsel to make the kind of arguments that they made. So at the trial involving this, the expert testimony was introduced that the child suffered from PTSD and dysthymic disorder or chronic depression. It doesn't say how old this child was, but she was scared. Both children were pretty young. There was also expert testimony on behalf of the mother that she suffered from, quote, battered woman syndrome, which, including testimony about the cycle of abuse that kept her trapped in the relationship. And this was an explanation for why she repeatedly returned to her abusive husband. But the court held that the mother's failure to protect the children from the trauma of witnessing domestic violence justified removal of the children. The fact that the mother was herself a victim didn't change the outcome. And so part of what the court's reasoning was that in assessing whether a child is abused or neglected, the court does not have to find fault on the part of the parent. It doesn't make any difference if the parent was at fault or was perpetrating the abuse or neglect, willfully or by her own choice. All that mattered was that the children were in danger, and that alone justified removal. So as you can imagine, this is a very controversial issue among domestic violence advocates, because many advocates see this as blaming the victim. And then you look at a situation involving the text messages, for example. Here the victim is terrified that the father of her child will try to take the child away by making false claims that she's abusing the child to CPS. But in fact, by staying in the relationship with him, she is at risk of losing her children for failing to protect the children from the violence. So, many victims just feel damned if they do and damned if they don't. They don't know where to turn. They're just terrified. But the legal doctrine is it's remaining in the relationship which is likely to lose your kids, not leaving the relationship. And just on a related note, many of our clients who are, low-income clients, if they're going to leave an abusive relationship, they're going to be in shelter housing, either emergency housing or domestic violence. And there's a common misconception in our community that if you're in a shelter with your kids, you can lose your kids because it's, anyone knows it's not great for kids to be in a shelter. But that's actually not true. And the legal definition of neglect states that neglect is not caused by financial constraints, or neglect caused by financial constraints is not grounds for removing a child. So if you're living in a shelter with your kids because of financial constraints, that is not a reason that your kids are going to be taken away from you. And that is it's a pretty common misconception. But staying in a relationship and having the kids witness the violence is a reason. So that brings us to duties of mandatory reporters, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. But just to review, the statute in D.C. in a hospital setting is very broad, includes physicians, psychologists, nurses, and really any person involved in the care and treatment of patients in this kind of setting. Does include social workers. One note here, it does not include lawyers. In fact, lawyers are under an opposite mandate. There's attorney-client privilege, so even if a lawyer, so we represented Sakai Johnson, for example, and by definition, we heard something for her that indicated that her kids, were being abused or neglected in the sense of witnessing domestic violence, we are not allowed to disclose it because of attorney-client privilege. So the test there is completely different. But mandatory reporters do include people in the hospital setting. And a person who's covered by the law who knows or has reasonable cause to suspect that the child who is known to him in a professional capacity has been, so in the past, or is in immediate danger of mental or physical abuse, has to immediately report to MPD or TC, Child and Family Services Agency. So that's pretty broad as well. It includes if they've been exposed in the past, and it knows or has reasonable cause to believe. You don't have to be 100% sure about it for this, just to have a reason to believe as what triggers the duty to report. Putting these two together, I would say that under DC law, when a child, now in your screening process, when a child reveals that the child is exposed to domestic violence in the home, or you discover it through discussions with the parent who's the victim of the violence and the children are looking at it, I would say generally that triggers a duty to report. Now, obviously, it depends on the facts and circumstances of every case. If you have questions, you would probably consult with your lawyer here in the hospital. But I would say that the general rule should be that does trigger a duty to report, depending, of course, on facts in each case. And the other thing that typically a good way to think about it is that if you have questions about it, it's best to just call it into CPS and let them investigate. They're the experts at investigating this kind of thing. Let them make the call. Calls to CPS, as you may know, anyone who calls CPS, it will never be, the name of the person who calls will never be revealed to the person who's being investigated. That's just by law. They can't reveal who called in a report. So what happens after reporting? So CFSA is required by law to investigate every report into the hotline. And then their term is if they substantiate abuse or neglect, or they find that it does occur, they may remove the child from the victim's custody. More typically now, because of various changes in CFSA policy, they are more likely to actually leave the child in the home with a safety plan. But a critical aspect of the safety plan is that the victim obtains a civil protection order. That is required, and in fact, obtaining a civil protection order is a defense to a charge of failing to protect the children. So let's look quickly at what is a civil protection order. So the legal caption is the victim, who's called the petitioner, files a petition against the abuser, who's called the respondent. And the purpose of this type of case is to allow the victim and her children to leave the abusive relationship safely. One thing to stress is that there will not be jail time for the respondent in this situation. It's a civil protection order, and it's not a criminal case. But if he violates the order, for example, the stay-away provision, then he can go to jail. But it's often important to counsel victims who are considering this. And, this distinction between civil and criminal is obviously kind of a nuanced one, but it is important for victims to understand that by filing for a CPO, they are not bringing criminal charges against the respondent, and he is not going to jail. And the order provides a wide range of relief, and it stays in effect for a year and can be renewed after that. So we'll look at the relief that's most important to victims, really of critical importance. The first is the most obvious. It's a stay-away order. The abuser cannot contact the petitioner, she's now called, or her children. Second, most importantly, is she is granted temporary custody of the children. It goes to the victim. And in addition, the court is required to assess child support. So she will be receiving some kind of child support if the abuser is employed, which is a big if in many situations. The other thing is it will make provisions for supervised visitation with the other parent. And going back to Sakai Johnson, I have to say I've counseled a lot of patients. 70% of them have children in common with the abuser. I've never heard a client say, I never want him to see the kids again. It's, in fact, the complete opposite. He's still the kid's father. I still want him to be in my children's life. It's, I want that relationship to continue. That's often what kept them in the relationship in the first place, was not wanting to lose the father for their children. So it can be important for victims to understand that there is a provision for supervised visitation. She can drop the kids off at the visitation center and leave. He can visit supervised by a social worker, and then she comes up to pick them up so that there's no face-to-face contact between the parents, and it's supervised for appropriate behavior by a social worker. And then another really important point, again, it goes to Sakai Johnson's point that she hoped he would be a better parent, is that he can be ordered to attend parenting classes, domestic violence intervention, alcohol and drug treatment, and mental health evals. And this is something we have often counseled clients about, particularly when it's a substance abuse issue that has been causing the violence, and this is a way for him to get help, actually. If he's been resisting it. And he could be ordered under some circumstance to vacate the shared residence. This is a very fast release. On the very same day that the victim goes into court to file the petition, she will get a temporary protection order, ex parte, meaning that the respondent won't be present. A judge will issue the order based on her testimony alone. She'll swear under oath, this is what happened, he abused me, or in legal terms committed an intrafamily offense, and based on that, she gets a temporary protection order, and that is all the same relief as a CPO, and it will be in effect for 2 weeks. There will be a hearing in 2 weeks, and he can attend the hearing to contest the CPO at that point, which is why it's really important for her to get a lawyer. And most petitioners who file in court can request and get free legal services from organizations like mine. Okay, crime victims comp. The same day she files for a petition, she becomes eligible for crime victims compensation. It will pay for 30 days emergency housing. This is often absolutely the crux of why a victim feels she can't leave. Where is she going to go? Well, she's entitled to 30 days emergency housing paid for by crime victims. Alternately, if the order is for him to leave the residence, it will pay for lock changes and security measures, will pay for her medical bills and lost wages due to domestic violence. Civil protection orders, it turns out, are extremely effective at keeping victims safe from future violence. The Department of Justice did a study in 2009 where they contacted victims nationwide who had obtained protection orders, and at 6 months, and 3 months and 6 months, and virtually 100% of them reported no further acts of physical violence, which is pretty extraordinary. A somewhat smaller percentage had a situation in which the respondent violated the no contact provision by trying to get in touch with her, but again, no more physical violence. And the one exception to this was abusers with prior criminal records who, as you can imagine, might not be very inclined to respect a court order. But on the main, for the most part, the orders were extremely effective at keeping victims safe, which is also a good thing to know. Quick detour onto teen dating violence. 1 in 3 adolescents in the United States is a victim of abuse from a dating partner, boyfriend or girlfriend. And so under GC law, an adolescent as young as 12 years can file for a CPO herself against an intimate partner herself without her parents' consent or involvement, because many adolescents don't want their parents to know that they're involved in an abusive relationship. So the law has kind of caught up with social reality in this situation. A couple of other important legal remedies. An employee cannot be fired for taking time off work to attend court. And a victim who is in a shared apartment and needs to leave could break her lease to flee violence. And I'll touch very quickly on immigration issues before we get to questions. Foreign-born undocumented women are especially vulnerable to domestic violence. We go back to the cell phone screens, frequently don't speak English. They may be isolated from their family, far away physically. They often come from a culture in which domestic violence is very common and accepted. Many people don't realize that millions of women in the world live in countries in which domestic violence is not illegal, including, amazingly, Russia. In Russia, if you physically abuse your wife, that is not illegal. That's not considered assault, and it's not against the law. And that's the case in many, many countries in the world. So there are many people in this country who come from countries in which that is the case. And so many people who are here illegally fear deportation of themselves, and they also fear deportation of the abuser because he's typically the sole source of support. Again, Sakai Johnson said she was dependent on her father of her children. He was the sole breadwinner. If the abuser is deported, how is she going to have any support? And a point here that people sometimes don't focus on is if you're in this country undocumented, you are not eligible to receive TANF or welfare benefits. So he's deported, what is she going to do? She can try to work, but if she has no one to care for her kids, she doesn't have TANF to fall back on as a safety net. There is no social safety net for her. And of course, this is only going to get worse as time goes on, unfortunately. So a couple of types of immigration relief. We talked about a U visa. It's available to a victim of crime who cooperates with law enforcement, creates a pathway to citizenship, and allows the petitioner to work here legally. I should note, people may be aware that the DREAM Act, some of the immigration relief that President Obama put into place was signed by executive order, including the DREAM Act. And that means that President-elect can eliminate it with the stroke of a pen on January 21st, unfortunately. But this immigration relief is by statute, so with a Republican-controlled Congress, that could be eliminated too, but it would take more time. They would have to actually pass a law to eliminate this. Violence Against Women Act, this comes into play when a victim is married to a U.S. citizen who's sponsoring her for citizenship. The U.S. citizen is abusing her. She can sponsor herself. The situation we see pretty frequently is what's called a mail order bride. Someone you meet online, she's in a different country. So the U.S. citizen sponsors her to come into this country on what's called a fiancé visa. She gets here and marries him, and he becomes abusive. And then the worst case scenario, she has a child with the abuser. The child is a U.S. citizen because born in this country. So if he withdraws his sponsorship for citizenship and she's deported, she will never see her child again. So it's an absolutely terrifying situation to be in. This is why the Violence Against Women Act was passed, to address that situation. And again, it's a statute, at least for now. A T visa is similar to U visa. It's victims who are trafficked into the United States for illegal purposes. Most commonly involves sex work, but it could involve other forms of forced labor. And asylum is something you may have heard of. This is a situation where a woman typically is a victim of gender-based violence in her home country, flees to the United States, and can be granted asylum on the grounds that if she returned to her home country, there would be no protection for her against the violence, the gender-based violence there. So these are all just to say that there are forms of immigration relief for foreign-born victims of violence. So just a couple of takeaways. Domestic violence, widespread everywhere, particularly in D.C. Very negative effects on children who are witnessing the violence in the home. And it is the case that victims really face substantial obstacles to leaving an abusive relationship, but there are very effective legal remedies to assist with that process if the victim knows about the availability of the remedies and gets the legal help that she needs to take advantage of them. a couple of resources. So actually, I think Dr. Jardis has put together a great resource pamphlet that's available here at the hospital. So I won't go into everything that's on it, but there is a National Domestic Violence Hotline that patients can call 24/7 to get help. And there's also a group called SAFE. These are advocates who help victims to file petitions for protection orders. They're located, the intake centers are in D.C. Superior Court, and there's also one at UMC in Southeast, and where Children's also has facilities there. So if you're seeing a patient at UMC, they really can just go to another section of the hospital, and they can actually file a petition there and get a temporary restraining order via video camera with a judge in Superior Court. So that's a very good resource for people in that section of the city who otherwise would maybe have trouble getting downtown. Also, the DC Volunteer Lawyers Project operates a domestic violence resource clinic. It's in Southwest DC. Anyone can come in, no appointment, speak to a lawyer. And we also have housing specialists, social workers, Metro cards, diapers, formula, a lot of things. Well, most people are bringing young kids with them, and people don't realize how expensive, like Metro is expensive to our clients. Diapers are almost prohibitively expensive. So anyway, small things that make life easier. And the information on our clinic is always on our website. It's always on the first page of our website right there. So that's it for me. I think we even have a few minutes left for questions. Yes.
Really extraordinary presentation, perfectly targeted to this audience. Thank you very, very much. You know, conceptually, pediatricians would much rather prevent a disease than treat a disease.
Sure.
And so if domestic violence is the disease, then what's the vaccination? How do we prevent it from happening at all?
Well, that gets to the point about identifying children exposed to violence and helping them or helping their parents or the victim parent to get out of that situation so that the child is no longer exposed to the violence, hopefully gets mental health treatment for the trauma that they've experienced, and that does stop those. Like, that's the most effective way to stop transmission of violence to the next generation. It truly is. And there are batterer intervention programs for adult batterers of domestic violence, and in fact, as we saw, you know, an abuser can be ordered to attend those programs. Honestly, I don't think their success rate is very high. There's not a whole lot of research on it, but it's not very promising as a treatment. So it's really preventing children from being exposed and giving the support to the victim to get out of the relationship and addressing her fears about all kinds of things, that her kids, that she'll lose her children, that she'll have nowhere to live, that he'll continue to come after her, that she'll continue to be unsafe. Really, the fears are understandable, but there really are remedies to all of those concerns. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a really wonderful presentation. I was actually just going to ask, given that we are in a tri-state area,
right, how
these types of presentations kind of relate to our patients that come from Virginia or Maryland or that live on the border. I don't know if everything's the same or if everything is totally different.
Right. No, that's a very good question. So I'm barred in D.C., so I really, as a lawyer, can't talk about legal programs elsewhere, but I can tell you there are provisions to get protection orders with basically the same provisions in Montgomery County, Maryland, and Virginia. Every state has this type of provision under the National Violence Against Women Act. So all of those same provisions apply. I think what's different is the response of child protection agencies in different jurisdictions. It can vary widely as to whether they even consider exposure to domestic violence to be child abuse. I mean, clearly it is in D.C. under, you know, court decisions, but other jurisdictions may take a different view of that.
Hi, thank you very much for that. Very informative. When for instance, a father has there's a restraining order against a father from a mother and child, and the mother and child come for a procedure at the hospital, what rights does he have for consent for that?
At the point that she has a civil protection order, none, because it's typically the protection order is going to give her both physical and legal custody of the child, and legal custody, full legal custody involves the right to make all decisions on behalf of the child, medical, legal, religious, everything. So,
and so the father has no say. Okay.
No, and you know, and he may subsequently negotiate in a longer-term custody action to get some of his legal custody rights back, but in domestic violence situation, we don't recommend it because obviously if they can't talk together, how can they reach joint decisions?
Yeah. Mary Ann Hilliard, I'm general counsel, and I just
oh, great.
Yeah, on behalf of children, so appreciate your being here. This is real helpful for the team, and they do deal with these issues all the time, so thank you for that. And in response to the question about our practice, about the rights of the father or the abuser, our practice, even when we're not in a domestic abuse situation, but when the families are quarreling and we have a decision that needs to be made, we tend to basically say to the parents that the parent who is going along with the advice of the medical team is the one that we're going to listen to today.
Right.
And then we say to the other parent, but we respect your rights if you go to court, we'll work with you. And it almost never happens, and sometimes they call the lawyers. But just to remind everybody here, too, you have a lawyer on call 24/7. We're here to support you with these kinds of tricky questions.
So the presumption, if there's not a civil protection order in place, or if there's no custody order in place, which is the rule, the presumption of the law is that the parents have equal rights, you know, equal joint custody. So that is a difficult situation when they disagree on medical issues, definitely. And sometimes patients do, or parents do have to go to court to get a clarification of who has legal custody for medical decision-making. But a CPO definitely grants both physical and legal custody to the victim.
Any other questions?
Yes. A quick question. With the U visas, is there a limit to the number of those visas that are issued each year? Or I've heard that, but I don't know whether that's true.
Yes, there is, but it's not typically a problem. It's not typically a constraint. What can be a problem is that it can take a long time, like, you know, 18 months to actually have the visa come through, just because everything involving immigration service takes a long time because they're really understaffed. But we've been, knock wood, successful in all of our U visa applications and actually getting them. It just takes a long time.
And just one other point on that, I think it's really important for us to be aware of that and to, you know, educate our patients about it when it's appropriate, because I understand that some advocates are a little hesitant about it because it seems to be a conflict of interest in certain cases to suggest that the victim go for a U visa. I've heard that too. So, I mean, only to say it's a good thing to know and it's a good thing to mention to our clients.
Yeah, when you say conflict of interest, the way I've often heard that is that if the abuser is being criminally charged, and if the victim applies for a U visa, which she's entitled to do, if she's on the stand as a witness saying this is, you know, testifying to the abuse, if the abuser is being criminally charged, she's entitled to a court-appointed lawyer. The first line of cross-examination will be, isn't it true that you're applying for a U visa, and that's the real reason you've made up this story of abuse against my client is for the purpose of getting citizenship here. So it's not a conflict of interest in a legal sense, it's a conflict of interest in the sense that it could be used to undermine her credibility in a criminal process against the abuser. That is definitely true, and that's why many lawyers advise a victim in those circumstances to wait until after the criminal prosecution to file for a U visa, and which is fine, by the way. You don't forfeit your rights. It's just going to take even more time. I think I saw a question here.
I'd also like to thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation. I had both a comment and a question.
Yeah.
The comment was you had shown the risk of, excuse me, of of ADHD and learning disabilities and children of that. It's an association may not be causative because, there obviously are familial and genetic issues in the family, and the same issues like having ADHD or learning differences, which may predispose someone to have impulsive actions and other things like that, could be passed on to their children. So that it's an association but may not be causative. The question I had was PSTD in children who have witnessed violence in countries where there's civil unrest versus this. Have there been studies looked at the outcome of those two types of experiencing violence?
Yeah, that's really, both the cause, I completely agree with you about the correlation causation, because domestic violence is often taking place in a poverty environment where there are just so many factors going on, but nonetheless, to the extent it's been studied, they have made efforts to isolate it from poverty by comparisons with peers. But still your point about the family and inherited tendencies does definitely play out. And in terms of PTSD in children who are exposed in war-torn countries, I don't know that much about that, but I do know that, like with all treatments of children, it can be really effective. The brain is plastic. Children they're still developing. There definitely are resources here in DC specifically to treat kids who have been exposed to any number of trauma. Safe Shores, for example, is a great organization that has, they do the forensic interviews of children who have been abused. You may have probably referred kids to them who reported, or perhaps you don't get involved, but if you see a child who's been abused physically or sexually, they probably go to Safe Shores for their forensic interview. And Safe Shores also has psychologists on staff who have expertise in this area and I think are really good. So, yeah, there can be good outcomes for kids in that situation.
And of course, Allison Jackson and the Child and Adolescent Protection Center wanted to be here, but is actually in court, also deals very closely with these sorts of issues as well. So just in closing, I wanted to not only thank Jenny Brody, but also to reiterate for those of you who walked in maybe a few minutes late, that Children's National has done domestic safety screening in the past, but in the last month, we've really gone live with a new revamped version that went live on October 27th to comply with national standards. And again, to reiterate, it has new screening questions, required fields, and an automated social work consult trigger for all positive screens. And so you may be seeing this concern pop up a little bit more in your practice in the inpatient setting and in the emergency department. It's hospital-wide, in APU, in pre-op, kind of really everywhere in this building right now except for outpatient. So there are resources that are available, the resource card that Jenny Brody was talking about, and then we have a website now. It's childrensnationalvictimsofviolence.org. I'm very happy to talk further with anybody who is interested or has questions. Again, my name's Lenore Jarvis. That's ljarvis@cnmc.org. And then, again, just thank you so much, Jenny Brody, for your time today. Really